How are you?
I'm okay. I'm tired. Had a long week.
Yeah, Community Day always puts us down on Sunday pretty well.
Well, I worked a lot this week. I'm
You did?
taking an extra project, so for work, not video work. So I've only live streamed this week. That's all I did.
Work.
Yeah, I streamed for almost 8 hours yesterday.
Yes, you did. Not more than 8 hours?
No, I went back and
okay.
counted.
Wow.
It was like...
That surprises me.
I think it was 7... Yeah, it was like 7 hours and 45 minutes.
I'm counting
You
it.
can count it as 8.
Third of a day. Yeah, it was a pretty good Community Day, though. Got a lot done. Both on gold. I don't know if you finished. I don't think you did.
No.
You did pretty well, though. Oh, you're... Okay. Aha.
I'm just like noob
Tut.
at this.
There was a lot of
not
stuff
having
on this table, so we had to get it organized
My
again.
wand is never ready anymore. No.
Wand's ready?
I'm good. Wand's ready.
All right, turn to page 49, The Leaky Cauldron.
Mm-hmm.
Today's lesson is called Freedom and Security. A synopsis. The chapter begins with Harry experiencing a freedom he'd never had before, wandering about Diagon Alley surrounded by witches, wizards, and all things magical. He checks out animals, equipment, books, food, and Quidditch supplies. While he's there, he runs into several classmates before finally seeing Ron and Hermione along with the rest of the Weasley family. Percy has been named head boy, Fred and George are as hilarious as ever, and Ginny seems to have fully recovered from her ordeal the previous year. Hermione purchases a new cat, Crookshanks, while Ron's sickly-looking rat, Scabbers, tries new medicine. Everything is going well until Harry overhears Arthur and Molly discussing whether Harry deserves to know that Sirius Black is after him and would likely try to kill him at first chance. They hope that the frightening guards of Azkaban prison will successfully recapture Black before the worst happens. This news looms over Harry's final evening, but doesn't cause him the fear Mr. and Mrs. Weasley anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a pretty short synopsis for a relatively long chapter.
It was a very long chapter, and there's so many details. And I like these chapters, but it's hard for me to focus for the podcast episode because it's another introduction of kind of like the depth of the wizarding world. So you have Harry. I feel like anytime Harry's in Diagon Alley, it's just like an explosion of like there's all these like little details that kind of they reveal there's more to this world. There's like histories and there's like theories and there's like all sorts of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I have a bunch of like sporadic things, and then I guess, I don't know, maybe in conversation towards the end we can get more of my like philosophical questions and stuff. But Transfiguration today. So Harry is in the Leaky Cauldron, and he's like he kind of like talks about his days leading up to getting ready to depart for Hogwarts again. And so he notices witches and wizards, and in one of his like commentary is that he sees Transfiguration today, and that is apparently a scholarly journal focused on the latest news on developments in the magical field of transfiguration, and it publishes articles and papers submitted by prominent and knowledgeable figures in the subject. So Dumbledore and McGonagall are both related to this
Have
publication.
they published there?
Yeah, so apparently when Dumbledore was a student in the 1890s, he wrote some papers to the magazine. And apparently at least one of them was on trans-species transformation, and the reason we know that is actually going to come later on. Bathilda Bagshot was impressed by the paper, and that's kind of like how she became acquainted with the Dumbledore family. But we also knew that Dumbledore found out, I guess, I don't know if we find out in this series or if it's like just part of canon, that he did teach transfiguration. And that's part of his, yeah. So Dumbledore being connected to Transfiguration today is one thing. And then McGonagall, by the end of her, this is writing about McGonagall on Pottermore, now Wizarding World. By the end of her education at Hogwarts, McGonagall achieved an impressive record. top grades in her Al's Newts Prefect Head Girl and winner of Transfiguration Today Most Promising Newcomer Award. So again, that's just like a little, it makes it feel real. Like you have these publications, you have these accolades, and it's just a whole society that exists.
Well, it's probably a good time for me to hop in with what I looked up, which was just head boy and head girl. I don't know if you looked at that.
No,
as well.
I did not.
There's not a lot about it.
Of like little details everywhere, but
it was that kind of chapter. I was like, I'm just gonna pick one.
Percy's gonna be head boy.
Percy is going to be head boy. There is the article was written a little ambiguously, but my understanding a little deeper is that there are head boy, head girl for each of the 4 houses.
Yes.
Their 7th year student. They don't have to have been a prefect. So you can become head boy or head girl having not been a prefect before. But they do oversee the prefects.
Okay.
One of the reasons it's a good segue is because both Albus Dumbledore and Minerva McGonagall were head boy and head girl. Respectively. Also, both of Harry's parents, apparently, and Bill Weasley as well.
Billiam.
Yeah, old Billy.
Well, yeah, the Weasleys, I think it was Molly who commented, right? She was like, oh, second.
Right. But it wasn't Charlie.
Second one, and then Fred or George, one of them was like, it'll be
the last. Yes, and then Ginny laughs, and it's all good.
Yeah.
I mean, Fred and George are the best. They really are. Oh, good to see you, old boy.
Oh my gosh.
Because Harry's like, it was like meeting the mayor.
I feel kind of bad for Percy because he's just, I mean, yeah, he's being extra and annoying, but then he's also being mocked for it. And it's just like so blatant. And Molly's trying to be like, all right, dude, that's enough. And even towards the end when they end up revealing that they took his badge and they changed it to Big Head or Big Head Boy. And Harry forces a laugh, politely, as Harry does.
I mean, I think it's a good point on Percy for sure. I also think it's fun to understand that mocking within the concept of him being quite big-headed and egotistical. I mean, like, we can both wonder about the mocking and also kind of understand where it's coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's kind of it's a weird dynamic because the Weasleys are or seem to be such humble people, and so like that sort of like, I don't know, uppityness doesn't seem to fit. So no, not in any obvious way. Yeah. Anything else on head boys?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.
So just some other random things. So a lunascope, which I was like, what is this? It's unsurprisingly has to do with the moon, Luna, and like
because they don't need moon charts anymore. That's what the guy says.
Yeah. So that was, I mean, that's so basically
you don't need your times tables. You got a calculator.
Yeah. Well, that there was that other thing that Harry saw. So like he went to Gringotts and got all his money, and he's like, oh, like he had to basically restrain himself.
The golden gobstone set.
The golden gobstone set. But there was this other thing that he was like, oh, I wouldn't have to go take another astronomy lesson again or whatever. It was like the thing that was in the little orb. Yeah. But yeah, that just made me laugh.
Well, it also cracked me up the description of gobstones because I never actually looked into it.
Oh, yeah. It makes more sense now.
Sprays some smelly thing on them.
Yeah, with the foundable, confoundable, like the Pixies have the gobstone set. And you actually play gobstones in Hogwarts Mystery, and I guess I never understood it because there is an explosion that happens when you're playing it, and I'm like, oh, I guess this is how you play. I don't know. The other thing that I looked up was this Florian Fortescue. I think that's how you say his name. Ice cream.
Fortescue? I don't know.
I don't know. Ice cream parlor. This parlor, because so like Harry's in there, and I'll get to that, but owned and operated by this guy named Florian before he disappeared in the future, in a few years, 1996. He's going to disappear.
He will.
In the future. But then when I was like looking this up, there was a thread of information which I didn't really catch on that Harry seems to be getting ice cream a lot in Diagon Alley. Like at the beginning, like every time he's like getting his books.
He's got a sweet tooth.
In book 1, Hagrid gives him a chocolate and raspberry flavored with chopped nuts.
I want ice cream.
At the beginning of book 2, Harry bought strawberry and peanut butter ice cream for him, Ron, and Hermione.
Okay, good call. This is good research. This is top quality. My gosh.
And then book 3 now, he's just getting free sundaes every half hour. Dudes.
Yeah. No. Apparently, Florian knows a lot about
the topic at hand. Right? Yeah. So good for Harry for getting that essay
He's
done.
Resourceful, yeah. Wikipedia, Florian.
Oh, man. Okay, and then we have, this is also very early on in the chapter, like all of these details, we're not even in like, I don't know, maybe 5 pages in, but the firebolt, we have this prototype for this new broomstick, and the part that stood out to me so like it's actually different, it's like a little flyer in the text of the book, so that's why it kind of stands out. But it says that it can go 150 miles per hour in 10 seconds. And I don't know if I've ever looked this up before, but when I was reading this, I was like, wait a minute, why are we talking about miles per hour? And I'm not the first person to ask this question. So apparently there's a whole entry on Wizarding World, and if you just search measurements, Pottermore or something of the like, it'll probably pop up for you. Apparently what was written on this entry is that British witches and wizards do not use electricity or computers. So when there was a switch to metric, or like a, adoption of the metric system, metric measurements, they chose not to adopt it. They ignored the change. They just like stuck with imperial measurements for stuff. This is according to J.K. Rowling.
Does that include inches for like the wands? Oh.
Wait, is that how Ron talked about? Was it 14 inches? Is that what he said?
Yeah.
So apparently when the first book was going under copy edits, she was advised to switch to metric units, and because it was standard. And basically she said that she refused the change, or the suggestion for the change, because there was no logic to it of like why would
reason for them to have changed.
Why would they have changed? And also she said that she finds the old system more picturesque, more quirkier, because it's metric is you're working in tens, and so like that
it's
being
very
consistent, systematic. And so her rationale was that no, they do that. Like they have galleons and sickles and knuts, so like it's kind of like whatever. That we'll just stick with this miles per hour. That was the only little fun fact that I found about there. Yeah. I mean, other little fragments is like when he's in the bookshop, he's like searching for books. Monster Book of Monsters comes up again, and we're like, oh, Hagrid, hey, and the dude's like driving. Like, oh,
I can imagine that guy's. I've always empathized with that guy really well.
Yeah.
This like and then Harry's like, oh, I already got one, and he's just like, oh gosh. And then he helps Harry really well.
Yeah. But he mentions
Ron and Hermione need 2.
The invisible book of invisibility.
Yeah.
That is definitely a con job.
It is.
That is not a real thing.
Yes, it is a con job for sure.
And can you imagine, like, because he's talking about like having 200 books, like this whole shipment.
I wonder who wrote it. Lockhart.
But can you imagine requiring that text, making a bunch of people try to purchase it, and like that, like what is that even? My goodness.
Classic.
Ron, so Harry ends up meeting up with Ron and Hermione. It's very, as we know with the beginning of the school year, everything with Harry is just so dramatic. Like his year starts are so dramatic. Like we go up until like the day before. The day before they're supposed to go get on the train, and he finally runs into them, and it's like, well, this is your last chance, But upon reading the chapter, realize there's more going on. But the more that I read into, like, more slowly with this, the more that Ron seems to have this role of like constantly bringing clarity to us as the readers, and like Harry as also like the kind of not knowing what's going on within the context of the Wizarding World. because Harry's like telling them about fudge, and he's like, yeah, I thought that I'd get arrested, and Ron's like, dude, you're Harry Potter.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah, so it was just kind of a funny like moment, because like Ron is very, and he even says like, oh, if they caught me doing that or blowing up my aunt, like I wonder what the ministry would do to me. So like he understands like
probably not that much.
No, but
it's
to
hard
an extent that more so than Harry. I mean, I think Harry will become more self-aware of like the dynamics and positionings and like what he means within the scope of the wizarding world. But
oh, Harold, the boy who lived.
And then we see Hermione again. She has tons of bags because she's taking all these classes and gets laughed at for taking Muggle studies.
Yeah.
And I loved how she said it'll be fascinating to study them from a wizarding point of view. And I think, because we had that question, I think it was at the last book when they were trying to decide for their classes, and I asked you like, what would you want to take? And I think I would want to take Muggle studies for this reason.
Hard pass.
Oh. I mean, I think that
I would exit the Muggle world.
When we were
pretty
talking
heavily.
more about it, like Muggle studies is probably what I would drop eventually. But I do think, in terms of like when we talk about like writing or telling stories or history and that sort of thing, and I think that it's interesting to think about how, like, what kinds of stories are told about Muggles in this wizarding world that where probably the people who write the stories aren't mostly people like Hermione. It's probably people who don't really have much interaction with Muggles. Maybe. I don't know. So I also looked up conversion for galleons, and so 10 galleons is probably between 50 and 60.
Oh yeah, because Harry's gonna have to ask his aunt and uncle for money.
Well,
he's
also
worried about that.
That Hermione's birthday is coming up in September, and so her.
I wonder what her birthday is.
I looked this up before, but I don't remember the exact date. But that was the whole Crookshanks thing. Oh, that scene was funny. Poor Ronald. Yeah. Just doing his best, you know.
Yeah, it's a very realistic scene. I like she goes in practical, like I'm gonna get an owl, and she comes out with a cat that has won her heart over, and she says that it's beautiful, and Harry's like, I guess that's a matter of opinion. He thinks that to himself.
Well, also probably because the lady told her like, Crookshanks has been there so long and nobody wanted to take it, so
it's very Hermione.
Yeah, just like, oh. Okay, and then we get to a lot happens. I feel like this chapter kind of like, you're like prancing along, you're like, oh yeah, the wizarding world, it's so much fun, blah blah blah.
Easy chapter.
You run into Neville Longbottom again, the real one, and
but Harry ignores him.
It's just so weird. But then we get to the point where it just escalates, like it just takes off. Like they're like getting all packed in the Leaky Cauldron. All of them are there. They're getting ministry cars. Percy is kind of like, what's this about? Arthur gets a little like
shifty.
Yeah. And then Harry overhears a conversation about him.
Yeah, he does. I mean, I don't know how I feel about it. I guess I can understand like the rationale to it. Like, what good is it gonna be for Harry to know that somebody is like trying to kill him? First of all, Voldemort is still trying to kill him, so it's not like that has gone away. Yeah. But apparently this is a more imminent threat. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I was particularly bothered at this point again, because this is the pattern over and over. Yeah, I know Harry. I mean, Arthur kind of mentions it. Like, Harry's 13 years old. Like, at what point are you going to treat him as a full person and not this, like,
this is always the question
child?
Of readiness, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've had that conversation before on the podcast, but it's worth restating, which is just, it is an educational and probably parental concept of somebody being ready or like becoming an adult. And obviously, like, there are some reasons for it to be 18 to be in the US to be considered an adult, but you know, all this stuff. But then there's still like counter narratives of like, oh, old enough to, you know, fight in the war, but they can't drink alcohol legally. So there's always these sorts of it's not a well-defined, being ready for some type of information is never a well-defined idea. And I suspect like our generation is shaped by growing up in a time where there's memes about helicopter parenting, right? And the idea of this is the freedom security dichotomy, right? Where like I hear about, you know, my parents and their generation and like biking everywhere and walking around, and your parents didn't know where you were because how would they? There's no cell phones, there's no anything.
Yeah.
And then you get to a point where it's like, well, you know, be careful in your own neighborhood, and it's like, well, okay, I guess yes, bad things could happen to you, but is that the is it appropriate to have those things in the front of your mind? My favorite quote in this chapter was about the death omens, and the bookseller is like, don't buy it.
Yes.
Because you'll see you'll see death everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think it's a parable on anxiety, right? Yep. Like you can't, if you worry about something, you will find it, even if it's not there. Like you will say that it's there. So
right.
I think this is obviously a much more acute, like this is literally somebody accused of murdering 13 people and convicted, like has said he's at Hogwarts in his sleep and now has broken out from a prison that people thought that couldn't happen. So like the threat is more substantial than just sort of blanket, oh, you know, be careful out there. Yes. Things are bad, or don't do this, and you know, you might get hurt. But I still wonder, like, it belies a misunderstanding of kids.
Yeah.
Because
well, Harry has that.
Harry
in his
will
mind.
find out whether they tell him or not.
Yeah.
So the question is, are you going to be open and honest about it, or is he going to have to piece it together in a sort of...
Yeah, it causes problems as well of like, I mean, at a certain point, once you realize adults have been lying to you over and over and over, like that's not good. What are you setting yourself up for if you constantly do this? And I mean, I think Harry's inner like thoughts really captured why, I mean, it kind of explains why it made me so angry, is because he's basically like, look, dudes, Voldemort has tried to kill me 3 times. Like,
how many times has he tried to kill you? 0.
And I've survived. I've been able to do stuff like, and it's just very frustrating because, and again, going back to my comment last week and also in previous episodes, like knowing that this is a children's series and relating to that frustration. And like, so when I think about like the narrative of like, oh, you know, pre-adolescence and so much angst, and you know, honestly, it's rightly justified because you're realizing a lot of things you've been lied to a lot, and you're kind of like, what is this? Why is this happening?
Yeah, and so I appreciate that like we get a more grayscale for this freedom security thing basically throughout the whole series, right? Where like somebody like Dumbledore doesn't prevent Harry from like going and fighting Voldemort twice, but he also doesn't tell him everything. So like you have that in the mix. Then you have Arthur and Molly who appear to disagree and do disagree. Then you have coming forward in this book, I think especially, is like Harry's relationship with Lupin when we meet him kind of describes the fact that he like is out of his age group and can make a Patronus and all this type of stuff. I think it's part of that description of like, this is a misunderstanding of what the school and childhood could be about or is about. Where like you have, I think on one side, you really get from adults this dual issue of like, children are innocent, so we should protect them, but also children are naive, so they couldn't know better. Yeah. But those two things like happen at the same time, right? If you keep people in the dark, of course they're going to seem naive, and you can justify it however you would like. Yeah. So that is what happens. I think McGonagall tends to treat Harry much more like a child than Dumbledore does. So it's a mixture, because then we also get like it's a worthy discussion every time it comes up. I'm not even sure if I've used this title before for an episode. I may have, but I was just like, it doesn't matter. It's
right.
It's a theme. So
yeah, I mean, I couldn't really find a central like place to do a deep dive, because once I started searching for things, so one of the first things that I started searching was kind of like age of majority, so like when you become an adult legally, and I wanted to find kind of more of like historically, like how was that constructed, that sort of thing. But then I kept getting distracted by all sorts of stuff. But yeah, for like all of these things of like, when we think about, I mean, we've had this conversation many times of like adults, the messaging of adults in a lot of circumstances is we know best. And so therefore this is why we do things. And it plays out in different ways. And it just, I think that what's frustrating is as someone who, being young and seeing through that sort of charade, but like not being able to do anything about it because who cares, I'm a kid, whatever. Like it I think there's like this I don't know, there's a lot to be unpacked, and I am interested in the sort of like, how did this come to be in the first place? Like, where did this first start of this sort of like, we are we know best. Like it's not, I don't know. I feel like there's lots.
There's probably some kind of Foucault thing to be done here. I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously we lived it, which is part of the reference, but I think most people do. And then like you talk to adults who are older than you, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I went through the same thing," and it's like, "Gosh, the wheels keep spinning. We do the same stuff to each other." And then I think also like our young adult lives being steeped in education. This is such a central idea in so many theories about schooling. Like when people have perspectives on schooling, it is almost, you cannot disconnect it from their theories on like maturity and I mean obviously that's a very strong statement, but I in conversation with people, it's always about like, is somebody ready or not? That is the fundamental question that most people answer their schooling theories with. But not everyone, because then there's counters of like, you need free time, you need play, you need like complete student autonomy at times to pursue whatever they'd like to pursue. No censorship, no boundaries, because why should there be? That the world doesn't have those types of boundaries. So it's a really touchy one for me, because it's been such a large part of our whole lives, I feel like. Yeah. And I think it's really relevant, obviously, in this chapter, because the whole setting of the chapter is this idea that Harry is experiencing this vibrant freedom while also being locked down to one lane, Diagon Alley and Leaky Cauldron. He can't leave. He's not allowed to leave. So you have this like weird balance of like, the reason he feels free isn't because he's free to do whatever he wants. It's because he happens to be in the place he wants to be. So he feels free. So it's a very unique situation. Yeah, I ended up getting to a point where I was like really deep into like psychological theories, and not it was more of like theories that kind of go towards like therapy and stuff. And so like theories about like how we've talked also off camera a lot about this idea of like it's not like kids are different species. They're just like tiny humans, and we're all just humans. And so like it's not surprising that, you know, some of our stuff from childhood also like manifests in how we act and interact as and not
adults.
That long ago, a lot of families were agricultural families, and kids would be at least part-time manual laborers starting pretty young. And then obviously like child labor laws, which have a clear kind of justice bend to them, but are still can be wondered about in terms of this like readiness to work, because then we start getting things like internships and things, and it gets real dicey real fast.
I'm wondering though, so thinking about like that sort of like, there's not really, it's not like child you, although I just did, I don't know if you watched this episode with me, but the episode of How I Met Your Mother where they're talking about doppelgangers, basically Ted at the end of the episode says something to the effect of like, we become doppelgangers of ourselves.
Right.
And so like, I was about to say like, it's not like adult you is like a whole different person than child you. It's like this connection and like it carries through. Obviously there are some differences, but it makes me wonder about the adults here and what they experienced in their formative years and how that shapes the way that they see the world and also respond to things. Like how is it that if you went through the first Wizarding War, like how does that shape the way that you see the Wizarding Society at large? And like, although that can be countered with this dynamic of like adult child, parent child, like that dynamic seems to carry through, but that could just be a recirculation of what you've experienced, and like it's just easier to kind of defer to that as a more socially accepted way of interacting or way of treating children or trying to protect them or protect them from pain or like make the decisions without their input because they wouldn't know anything or you don't see them as contributing. It's very messy, of course, but something I think that still needs to be named whenever it comes
it's the
out,
same conversation we've had. I mean, it is a legitimate dilemma. Like there's no clear victor. I think you can take principled stances on either side. Like you can easily take a principled stance and say like it is childhood innocence that should be protected at all costs as long as possible. Then you can poke holes in that pretty quickly because I think at least pretty much everyone that I know at my age, it's like, well, yeah, I wasn't ever as innocent. Like at some point the innocence faded, but then the presumption of innocence keeps going on.
It makes me wonder if it kind of like makes the parents feel better if you pretend like your child is so innocent or like not, you know?
And the internet, I mean, there was no hope. We've talked about that as well of like, even if our parents would have wanted a certain thing, once the internet was a thing, like, and we generally, maybe as users of the internet, outstripped our parents' generation very quickly of like understanding it and like being cultured in it. And it's a pretty toxic place. Got news for you. It can also be quite wonderful, but there was never I wonder about like previous generations and what they maybe experienced as kids and how they dealt with like being labeled an adolescent. Yeah. Because Harry is I don't know if he feels betrayed. It doesn't seem like it. I think he reckons with the fact that it's useful that they state in their private conversation that they don't want him to be afraid because there's nothing that he can do about it. Like it's going to be the prison guards or somebody or Dumbledore or somebody that's going to catch him. Yeah,
he kind of just takes it as a like, oh, here's new information. Right. But I think that the longer we are with Harry on this journey, I think we see that development in how he feels about it, because I feel like we're still on the cusp of it. It's not innocence, but it's sort of this like naive trust, I guess, that he still has this of like, oh yeah, like they're the adults, like I'm going to like still obey them or like I don't know, follow them. He still is mischievous, but not to the extent of like full-on rebellion, let's overthrow this, that's a different kind of feeling, and that doesn't seem to be his reaction here. But even though it's something that's kind of like, whoa, I'm like reading this whole conversation, I'm like, dude, Harry, this is a bombshell. Like everything that is happening is not what is happening. And also I'm excited for in the rest of this book, like you mentioned that book with the bad omens or whatever, the death omens, that's going to come around again, I think, for another philosophical conversation about
because he wonders if that was what he saw, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we'll probably have this same conversation at some later time, but it's I think it's particularly salient in this book because this is much, I think that's the reason why it's so many people's favorite story. This is the coming to age one.
A lot of people tell me that this is their favorite. Yeah.
I think it's because like Harry is, he's not helped in the same way. Like he gets through book 1 and book 2 in somewhat like kind of ludicrous ways. Dumbledore's hand is so clearly like involved, and then in this one it's like no, Harry will be the Harry. Dumbledore is still involved, but more peripherally. Cool.
All right.
Anything else?
No, that's all for me.
Okay. Until next time. Wand's ready.
Ready.